Okay, so I was talking about the text. As I say, I'll go through some of the previous text. See, as I say, my internet connection isn't great. Guess we'd better get on with this. If you want to ask any questions, you can speak into the microphone or type something. I've got the chat messages next to my screen, so I can see straight away if somebody is typing anything. Other than that, I guess we will get on with it. Okay, as I usually do, I will start with a headline, which was taken from a few months ago. So not that most recent, but I basically did a quick Google search on something in relation to American foreign policy, Africa. A couple of headlines came up. This was one of them. And the reason I chose this one is that I think it sort of does quite closely reflect the sort of Trump view of Africa, or let's say his main sort of concerns when it comes to countries in Africa and also, you might say, the developing world in general. The headline, US travel ban, Trump restricts immigration from Nigeria and 5 other countries. So yeah, immigration is certainly one of the things that the Trump administration has been most concerned about. Shortly after Trump became president, so we're talking about the beginning of 2017, one of his first actions was to impose a travel ban against a group of countries, mainly Islamic countries. I can't remember if there were any explicitly from Africa. Maybe Egypt, Libya, places like that were included. I can't remember now. But certainly, yeah, limiting immigration from overseas countries, that has been a preoccupation of the United States. So limiting travel from, as I say, Africa and other parts of the developing world. And that obviously has had some sort of impact on America's relations with with countries from these parts of the world, and we will kind of get back onto that. So that's one obvious area in which the United States, under the current administration, under Donald Trump, has been kind of, let's say, involved in African affairs. Another area of concern, and again, we'll talk about this when we get onto Trump towards the end. I say Trump, but also this was a concern for the Obama administration, and that is the involvement of China in Africa, as well as other parts of the world. So growing Chinese influence on the continent. And again, we have a little cartoon which sort of makes the point. Chinese officials obviously visiting an African country. One of them got a contract in his hand and saying, the only thing we will not try to sell you is democracy. In other words, China is willing to give out economic assistance, invest in various African countries. But unlike Western countries, including the United States, the Chinese have not been overly concerned with trying to promote human rights, democracy, anything like that. So yeah, growing Chinese influence in Africa, that is another area that, as I said, the current administration, so the Trump administration, but also Obama as well, before Trump was looking at this sort of situation quite closely. So again, we might talk about that. Obviously, from the point of view of African states, China, particularly if you're, let's say, authoritarian leader in an African state, then China might well be viewed as a sort of welcome alternative to to sort of Western aid simply because, as as the cartoon makes clear, that they are not going to be overly concerned about human rights, democracy, things like that. Okay, quick map then. If you're looking at it again, I probably should have replaced the map because it's not entirely up to date. Notably, Sudan has not been divided. There's a new state now, South Sudan, but more or less as it should be. Okay, and yeah, as usual, when talking about geographical regions, I think it's worth looking at one or two countries in particular, those which have one way or the other sort of important relationship with the United States. Either they are friends of the United States or they are less than friendly, let's put it that way, towards the United States. Some countries can be viewed as being strategically quite important. Others might be viewed as being economically quite important. So yeah, let's have a quick look at the map. Maybe I'll ask you a quick question, just to see if anybody's listening. Are there any countries, do you think, in Africa which are particularly important for America? A minute. If we had to choose one or two particular countries, do we think there are any there which, let's say, might be viewed as being more important than others? I'm going to sip some water while I wait. Okay, let's start breaking this down. Nobody's come through, so I'll move on a little bit. I would say there are one or two countries which, in economic terms, so perhaps in terms of being Africa's sort of largest economies, are perhaps of greater significance. The most developed country on the continent is undoubtedly South Africa, right at the tip. South Africa obviously was once a British colony, has quite a large, white population, and black African a much bigger, majority black African population. But yeah, South Africa is almost certainly the most developed economy. South Africa often included among what are known as the BRICS countries, so the group of developing countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So South Africa important, as I say, in terms of being the most developed economy. Like many African countries, South Africa has a big mining industry. This is true for a lot of them, so a lot of minerals. Other commodities are sort of produced in South Africa. South Africa, is, in terms of its climate, quite similar to Europe or Northern Europe. So, obviously right on the tip, so well away from from the equator, the hottest parts of Africa. So, its climate is quite hospitable. So yeah, as I say, in general, as well as sort of politically, there's been a sort of long-standing relationship between the United States and South Africa. During the Cold War, South Africa was very much part of the sort of anti-communist bloc. Although its sort of political system, the apartheid system, during the Cold War meant that, relations with South Africa were often quite problematic, and it was quite a controversial relationship. But yeah, there are sort of fairly close ties. Thinking about one or two other countries, the next biggest, well, I think Nigeria has the continent's biggest economy, mainly because it is the biggest oil producer in Africa. So Nigerian economy relies very heavily on oil exports. It is also, as you can see on the map, a big country. So yeah, Nigeria also, you would say is an area of interest, let's say, to the United States. The other thing to say, of course, about Africa, we're lumping it all together, but first of all, it's a huge continent. Something we sometimes, I think, forget this. I was reading somewhere, you could fit the United States, Europe, I think maybe even Canada into Africa quite comfortably. So it is a huge continent, and it has a very sort of diverse um, it's very diverse, let's say, in terms of its population, in terms of the people who live there, the cultures. So, as I say, we often sort of lump Africa together as though it's one single kind of homogenous entity. But of course, as I say, it is very, very diverse. There are a lot of differences culturally, ethnic groups, all the rest of it. So, this is a very complex uh, uh, um, um, continent in terms of the various groups and social relationships between these groups and all the rest of it. Part of the diversity, of course, is the sort of different religions which exist, and of course, there's a clear divide between, if you like, the sort of North Africa, which is largely Muslim in terms of its religious. Further south, sometimes we divide the continent into northern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, so those countries below the excuse me, the Saharan desert, which aren't, or let's say, a lot less Muslim, if I can put it that way. Other religious traditions. So yeah, North Africa obviously important. First of all, it's important because of its relative geographical closeness to the West. If by West we mean Europe, from Europe. It's significant as well, as I say, because the countries there are predominantly sort of Muslim, and given the sort of the war on terror, things like that, means that obviously the United States has to take a fairly close look in this has to be fairly closely involved in this region. So my voice isn't suddenly going. I've had a couple of other classes today, so I was starting to sound slightly croaky here, but not to worry, I'll manage. So yeah, so as I say, the fact that the northern part of Africa is Muslim, and yeah, I mean, Al Qaeda, Islamic State have certainly been pretty active in many of the countries in North Africa. For a time, Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which again was seen as quite a radical movement, came to power after the Arab Spring, but were then sort of removed in a military coup. Islamic State and other radical groups have been actually quite active in Libya. And then you've got countries like Mali, Niger, which again, there've been groups affiliated with Al Qaeda and other sort of radical Islamic groups. They've been operating in that area. So yeah, North Africa, obviously, an important element in terms of the war on terror, which the United States has been, which has, let's say, driven American policy for the last 20 years or so, slightly less than 20 years. Then you've got Central Africa, which is by far the poorest parts. In fact, these are the most poorest parts of the world. So you've got Zaire, which used to be the Central African Republic. Zaire, which used to be the Congo, I should say, which huge country, but very impoverished. But again, like as I say, like a lot of African countries, big sort of producer in terms of commodities and things like that. And yes, there are certainly American kind of economic interests, mining interests in this area, in this region. But there's also a region, as I say, a lot of poverty and a lot of political instability as well. One other thing I'll say before we move on into the next slide is, in terms of the various sort of political systems, let's say, of various African governments. Yeah, for a brief period in the 1990s, it did seem like that democracy was sort of spreading across the continent. I think a majority of African countries by the late 90s were more or less considered to be democratic. Last few years, though, you've seen a sort of weakening of democracy right across the continent, which has created concern, let's say, on the part of the West. So that's also something that kind of obviously affects affects relations between Africa and Western governments, including the United States. Right. Okay. So yeah, we highlighted one or two. Okay, American interests in Africa. So this is our first slide with text, let's say. First point there, yeah, historically the United States has neglected Africa. Okay, so historically America has not actually had a huge amount of involvement when it comes to African affairs. You contrast, I'll go back to the previous slide. You contrast the United States' relations with Africa with that of Europe. Well, obviously, in the 19th century, most of Africa was actually governed by European powers, mainly Britain, France, but also Belgium. Germany had one or two African colonies, the Dutch as well. So obviously, European countries did and to some extent still do have quite close ties with various parts, with various parts of Africa. Obviously, the United States was not a colonial power in Africa. So in that sense, historically, America has been a lot less involved, let's say, in African affairs. Of course, there is a big African American population in the United States, so a significant percentage of the American population can trace its roots back to Africa. Obviously, their ancestors, for the most part, were slaves working in America's plantations. But generally speaking, as I say, there haven't been very sort of close ties between the United States and Africa historically. One partial exception is Sierra Leone, which became a sort of free state and freed slaves, or slaves which escaped, often ended up in Sierra Leone. The capital of Sierra Leone is Freetown. It's called Freetown for that reason. But apart from that, as I say, America's sort of historical associations, historical links with Africa, are relatively limited. Certainly when you compare them with Europe. Africa, I think I've got a couple of slides on this. So hang on, just check. Yeah, I do. Okay. Africa, though, an area of superpower competition during the Cold War. We'll talk very quickly about that, but I don't want to spend too much time on the Cold War. Then the Cold War ends in the 1990s, and sometimes it is argued that the United States sort of forgets about Africa, or at least Africa is no longer considered to be very important in terms of American interests. So there is quite a sharp reduction in American engagement in African affairs, I would say, in the 1990s when the Cold War ends. That's sort of reversed, I think, after 9/11. And again, for the reasons we've just mentioned, the fact that many African states are Islamic, and there are kind of radical groups operating in Africa which had links with Al-Qaeda. So I think 9/11 sort of reactivated America's interest in African states. Also the fact that failed states in Africa were potentially the source of terrorism. We'll talk about that as well. Africa, an important source of oil. We mentioned that. I mentioned Nigeria, Libya as well. I think there are other African states which are also oil producers. US concerned about Chinese influence and the spread of HIV. Okay, HIV. Which, again, thinking about the current health crisis with the coronavirus. Well, Africa's been living with a massive health crisis now for, well, 20, 30 years or so in the shape of HIV, AIDS. And I think can make sort of parallels between how sort of coronavirus has sort of spreading across the world and how sort of HIV was also another sort of health crisis, a lot less contagious, obviously, than the coronavirus, but one that has impacted upon Africa, especially. Okay, very quickly now, I don't want to talk too much about the Cold War period, but just worth noting in passing that during the Cold War, Africa does become something of a Cold War battleground. And essentially, yeah, both superpowers, so both America, Communist Russia, or the Soviet Union, yeah, both America and the Russians basically try and develop ties with various client states. So you either tended to be pro-communist or pro-American. Should be said, and it says that the United States supported various of its allies in Africa. One example was Mobutu in Zaire, which today is the Congo. And Mobutu had an absolutely appalling human rights record. But he was anti-communist, so the CIA and the Americans were quite happy to sort of work with him. Mentioned a moment ago, the apartheid government in South Africa, again anti-communist, and again a government with a very dubious human rights record, but one that the United States, again, was quite happy to work with. Similarly, the Soviets and the Cubans. Cuba also was involved as a kind of Russian proxy in African affairs in the 1970s. Soviet and Cuban activities contributed to the end of détente in the late 1970s between the Americans and the Russians. If I'll just go back to our map, in particular, Cuba sends military forces to fight in Angola, which becomes a source of concern. And then the Russians, and I think also the Cubans, were quite heavily involved in what in English we describe as the Horn of Africa. So that's basically Ethiopia and Somalia. And yeah, as I say, Russian activities there created sort of increasing unease on the part of the United States. So yeah, Africa does become a fairly important, as I say, Cold War battleground in the 1970s, 1980s. Obviously, just one final point on that is that many of the countries in the 1970s were, well, most of them in fact, were ex-European colonies. So in the 1950s and 1960s, a number of African countries start achieving independence, and they become, they become independent. And so to a certain extent, that's what brings the Americans and the Russians in. Both are quite keen to sort of cultivate their ties with as I say, various African client states. End of the Cold War, late 1980s, you see a brief burst of American activism in African affairs. I think the Americans were quite heavily involved in a number of in trying to sort of fix relations between a number of African countries which found themselves in conflict with one another. I mentioned on the slide there, the Americans do work to bring peace between Angola and Mozambique. You have Bush. This is Bush 41. So the older Bush, if I can put it that way, president in the early 90s, talking about this idea of a new world order. And I think there is this sort of hope in the early 90s that with the Cold War coming to an end, Africa was going to make this sort of transition. I say Africa, but various countries inside Africa were going to make a transition towards democracy. And I think there were hopes that, now that, in Francis Fukuyama's words, history had come to an end, that Africa was going to be able to achieve more stability, more prosperity. So I think people were relatively optimistic in the early 1990s. America assisted with the democratic transition in Ethiopia. Ethiopia had a Marxist government in the 1980s, but that is finally overthrown. US with the UK and France, that development aid would actually depend on democratization. So, quite a close connection. So, whereas during the Cold War, the United States wasn't particularly interested in whether governments in Africa were particularly democratic or what their human rights record was like, as long as they were anti-communist. When the Cold War comes to an end, the Americans, along with some European countries, are saying that they were going to prioritize promoting democratic institutions on the continent. Then, yes, 1992-93, I think we've mentioned this before when we talked a little bit about the CNN effect and the American media. I think that was a long time ago. I think that was when we were actually in a classroom together. But we mentioned, George Bush, right towards the end of his presidency. So Bush sort of retires at the beginning of 1993. End of 92, though, Bush decides to send in military forces into Somalia on a humanitarian mission. So basically, Somalia had become a failed state. The government had collapsed. The people in there were living in, the conditions there had deteriorated quite markedly. So, as I said, the United States intervenes for humanitarian reasons in 1992. The job of American forces being to provide humanitarian relief, aid, things like that. And then Clinton, when he becomes president after Bush, inherits this mission. So Clinton, he becomes president and he inherits this mission from Bush. And as we've discussed before, basically the mission goes very badly wrong. A load of American soldiers get killed. There's a big firefight in Mogadishu. And it receives an awful lot of media coverage. And this is why some people talk about this idea of a CNN effect. The argument being that the Clinton administration's decisions in Somalia were basically being based around the media coverage. Now, again, that's debatable. When we talked a little bit about the role of the American media, we mentioned the CNN effect, and I think the evidence for how much influence CNN wielded when it came to the Clinton administration's decisions is to some extent debatable. But nonetheless, the intervention, the Somalian mission, does receive a lot of coverage, and it damages Clinton quite significant politically. When this operation goes wrong, and as I say, the media covers it so publicly, this does actually sort of damage Clinton. One consequence of that is that Clinton becomes, I say this, sorry, I forgot I had this slide, but sort of explains kind of what basically happens. Okay, so it's Clinton's first foreign policy challenge. US sort of peacekeepers or US military forces come into contact with General Adid, who was a Somali warlord. And Clinton basically withdraws American forces after some soldiers get killed. And as I say, Clinton politically is really badly damaged as a result of Somalia. One consequence of this is, as I say on this slide here, Clinton issues what's known as a Presidential Decision Directive, PDD 25, which was issued in May 1994, where Clinton says he would only deploy peacekeepers or military forces in other parts of the world if it was in America's national interests. This has rather tragic consequences because shortly after Clinton makes this decision, the situation in Rwanda begins to deteriorate. Tribal warfare sort of breaks out, and between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and it ends in genocide in Rwanda. And as I say, it has tragic consequences because the Clinton administration deliberately decides that it is not going to send any military forces to try and stop this, to try and bring the genocide in Rwanda to an end. So as I say there, US basically refuses to send forces. In fact, the Clinton administration refused to even use the word genocide to describe what is happening in Rwanda, simply because America is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. So if they'd officially acknowledged that, there was a genocide happening in Rwanda, I think the United States, under the Genocide Convention, was legally obliged to sort of intervene to stop it. But Clinton, as I say, doesn't do so. And that, again, has some it has huge humanitarian consequences for Rwanda itself. So I'm just I was just checking. Two tribes being the Hutus and the Tutsis, and it was the Tutsi. I couldn't remember exactly which one, but it was the Tutsi tribe being kind of massacred by the Hutus. So it had obviously has huge consequences. It's devastating for Rwanda, but it also has huge consequences for American sort of foreign policy. As I say, Clinton's decision, very deliberate decision not to send troops. As the sheer scale of the genocide kind of emerges, as people come to know just how bad the situation in Rwanda actually was, I think there was a sort of growing feeling that that Clinton had made a mistake, and that Clinton subsequently acknowledges this. He subsequently said, "Look, I know we should have intervened. We should have brought this under control." I think Clinton visits Africa quite late in his presidency, and he basically apologizes for not doing more to stop what was happening in Rwanda. Another person is who's quite seriously affected by Rwanda. Was an official in the Clinton administration called Susan Rice, who later becomes a very, very senior figure in the Obama administration. And she, too, is sort of haunted by Rwanda and feels that the United States should have done much more to stop it. And I think that is quite significant when one considers the Obama administration's response to developments in Africa, which we will get onto. Again, made the same mistake. I've got a slide here on this. So Clinton doesn't describe it as genocide. Essentially, Americans basically say that it should be African military forces being used for peacekeeping. So he wanted, regional African forces to take this sort of responsibility. America's put less pressure on some African governments to democratize. I think, again, there was a fear that democracy could perhaps exacerbate tribal and ethnic tensions in some countries. Burundi being a case in point. Burundi quite similar in some ways to, a much smaller country, I think, than Rwanda, but quite similar in terms of its sort of tribal divisions. During the 1990s, also, American aid budget is significantly reduced in terms of the amount that Africa gets, which again sort of reflects the fact that the United States is rather less interested in African affairs. Okay, I'll just have a quick sip of water. Okay, Clinton's second term. So we're talking about the late 1990s. Mid to late 1990s, so second term is beginning of 97 through to 2001. A couple of things to note here. First point, as I said on the slide, Clinton decides that he is going to appoint Madeleine Albright as his Secretary of State. So she was going to be in charge of American foreign policy. And that's significant because by temperament, she was an interventionist. So she was somebody who was very firmly committed to the idea of humanitarian intervention. And second point there, Clinton administration tries to address several security threats emanating from Africa. I mean, Clinton sort of likes the idea of globalization, but he acknowledges there are sort of negative consequences. So he recognized that, things could happen in Africa which could cause problems for the United States. These included things like wars, terrorism, spread of diseases such as HIV/AIDS, drugs, things like that. So I think there is a sort of recognition that the United States cannot afford to ignore Africa altogether. Under Clinton, as I say, US established a program for training African troops. I should just go back to our map. There is actually an American military base in Djibouti, which is right at the end of the Red Sea, next to Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia. So strategically, again, that's quite important. As I say, it's right on the edge, right, connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. So the Americans do actually have, a sort of military presence there. Go back to my slide. Where were we? Oh yes, okay. And yeah, this is significant. In 1998, Al Qaeda attacks American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. They also attack a US warship. And it's around this time, I suppose, that Al Qaeda emerges to become, I suppose, in the public mind at least, as a fairly significant security threat. So it's worth noting that Al Qaeda's first major attacks take place in Africa. I think at this time, Al Qaeda, at least up until the late 90s, Al Qaeda was largely based in Sudan. And it's towards the end of the 90s that they then kind of relocate to Afghanistan. But yeah, there are attacks in Kenya, Tanzania. As I say, an American warship is also targeted by Al Qaeda. And then several conflicts also resume in Africa in this period: Ethiopia, Eritrea, Angola, Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly Zaire. Again, it's showing that instability was still a problem. Obviously, poverty a major factor behind this. Africa remained. I mean, another thing to say about Africa in the 1990s, whereas most of the rest of the world was getting richer, even in the developing world. So in Asia, South America, Central America, most countries' economic conditions were improving in the 1990s. That was not the case in Africa, especially not in sub-Saharan Africa. So, as I say, countries like the Congo, basically stay extremely poor, which obviously is one of Africa's single biggest challenge. Obviously, is a sort of major contributory factor to the sort of instability that the continent was facing. Staying with Clinton a moment longer, so again we're in the 90s. Both Clinton and George Bush do actually take quite an active interest in combating the AIDS epidemic in Africa. So Clinton starts this, but George Bush, whose foreign policy was relatively inactive in some ways, but I suppose one area where he did receive a fair amount of praise was the amount of resources that the United States actually did devote to health in the developing world, especially, as I say, when it came to combating the AIDS epidemic. Clinton also passes the African Growth and Opportunity Act, so there is some effort to try and increase the amount of aid and assistance that the United States gives to Africa. Again, as I mentioned, Clinton, a great believer in globalization, a feeling that globalization contributed to economic growth. So Clinton's answer to Africa's problems was to try and integrate Africa into the wider sort of global economy. As I say, we're generalizing now. I mean, there's obviously a large number of different African states, but the general view was that economic integrating Africa, as I say, into the global economy would be beneficial. Although critics argue that essentially it was more about America trying to gain access to Africa's natural resources. I mean, again, another thing to say about Africa is that it is immensely rich in resources, in things like oil, diamonds, gold, various other minerals. So, which to some extent has been more of a curse than a blessing. So it's been more of a problem for Africa. The fact that there is so much abundance in these sorts of resources, simply because, well, first of all, it's sort of attracted outside interests. So it's attracted, first European and today, American and other countries' interests, mining industries and things like that. And it's also sort of basically contributed to corruption. There's been a sort of lack of incentive, let's say, on the part of various African governments to develop their economies when they can simply sell whatever their countries are producing and keep some of the profits for themselves. So yeah, as I say, natural resources in Africa have basically sort of fueled corruption in many countries and perhaps have actually held Africa back. Then towards the end, as mentioned here, senior officials from the Clinton administration do visit Africa, including Clinton himself, who goes to Africa for 2 weeks in 1998, visits several African countries. And I think it's during this visit that Clinton, as I say, publicly sort of apologizes for the lack of American activities in Africa. Okay, a headline here. This was from 2012. It's obviously not a very recent headline, but it sort of makes the point that, Africa has been, quite a significant front on the war on terror. Africa's Islamist militants coordinate efforts. So we're talking about Islamic groups in Africa coordinating their efforts. 3 of Africa's largest militant Islamic groups are trying to coordinate their efforts, the head of the US Africa Command has warned. One point to make about this headline is, I think we talked about this in terms of the American military. The US military is organized on a global basis. And there is literally one American general in charge of each continent. So there is an American African command. Now, it should be said, America doesn't have. Let's go back to our map. America doesn't have a very big military footprint in Africa when you compare Africa with other continents. We mentioned the base in Djibouti, and I don't think there is much beyond that in terms of permanent American military bases. So as I say, the American military footprint is much lighter in Africa than it is in other parts of the world. You compare Africa obviously with Europe, but also Southern Asia, certainly Latin America. As a US military, a lot less prominent. But as I say, nonetheless, there is an African command. So there, part of the US Army is sort of directed towards monitoring what is happening in Africa. Africa after 9/11. Bush administration obviously takes a much closer interest in African affairs, especially North Africa. So as I say, it's the northern part of Africa, which is the Islamic, as the Islamic part of Africa. So we'll talk a little bit about George Bush and the war on terror on another occasion. But I mean, Bush initially, as it says there, quite critical of the idea of nation building. So was not a believer that the United States should be intervening directly and helping to rebuild countries abroad. That attitude changes after 9/11. So initially, Bush is quite isolationist, or at least he's somebody who feels that America should not be too closely involved in the developing world. That attitude, as I say, shifts quite significantly after 9/11 for several reasons, one of which there's this kind of recognition that failed states produce terrorists. So states whose governmental institutions have basically collapsed, these states are a breeding ground for terrorists. So I mentioned earlier, we mentioned Somalia and the American intervention there. Al-Qaeda was based in Africa, as we mentioned. In the 1990s, I think they were mainly based in Sudan. There've been terrorist attacks in Africa. Should say, 9/11 is the first operation by Al-Qaeda based on American territory. Before that, the organization had been sort of active in the developing world in Africa and Southern Asia. So I think after 9/11, there's a sort of recognition on the part of the United States that they can no longer just simply ignore African affairs, that the United States has to sort of take a much closer interest. So they established a combined joint task force Horn of Africa. And I think that is the base in Djibouti. So the United States does begin to have some kind of direct military presence on the ground. American diplomats, I think, become more active in African affairs, in sort of encouraging various governments in the region to try and limit the activities of radical Islamist groups. We also become more active in terms of conflict resolution between various African states. So as I say, having started off with a relatively passive foreign policy, Bush after 9/11 becomes much more active, and that certainly does include Africa. And as we noted, Africa, a large part of Africa was Islamic. The Pan Sahel initiative in Djibouti, again, this is direct American engagement. I think the textbook talks a little bit about this, so I'll let you check this because I've partially forgotten what this involves. But in general, as I said, Bush wants African states to act against terrorism. Bush supports anti-Islamic forces in Somalia as well. Critics, though, of these policies, there is, after 9/11, the other thing to say is that there is a really clear sort of militarization of American policy. So in terms of the war on terror, the Bush administration very much emphasizes the importance of the sort of US military when it comes to containing militant Islamic groups. And critics argue, the final point there, basically that these sorts of initiatives only serve to achieve greater levels of instability. And I suppose critics say that the war on terror wasn't doing anything to try and deal with Africa's sort of underlying problems, particularly its sort of weak levels of economic development. So the argument being that political instability, radical Islam, a lot of it was sort of rooted in Africa's poverty, which the Bush administration, arguably was less concerned about. They did not, though, ignore it altogether. In particular, on this slide, as mentioned, it mentioned the 2003 Millennium Challenge account. attach strict political conditions to aid. So the United States, along with other Western countries, at the beginning of the 21st century, do sort of commit themselves to helping Africa develop economically. I think the Bush administration was somewhat, I think, perhaps sort of slightly more reluctant than other countries to invest in these in these activities. And as I say, strict political conditions were attached to any American aid. Then you have a situation in the Darfur region, again, a very poor part of Africa, again, a lot of instability. Critics and other Western countries were not doing enough to try and improve conditions there. As we mentioned earlier, America is also importing a lot of oil from Africa. So Africa, sort of in strategic terms, quite important in those terms. Nigeria, especially, is something that is a country of particular importance. And Chinese interest in the region have dramatically increased in Africa in recent years. I wrote this a few years ago. If anything, the Chinese influence has become even greater, and we will sort of come on to that in a moment. Let's quickly talk a little bit about Obama. Obama's record in Africa. First of all, obviously, America's first black president. Excuse me. And Obama is the first American president with direct ties with Africa. His father obviously came from Kenya. He was a Kenyan diplomat who was, working in the United States when he met Obama's mother. So yes, as I say, Obama obviously had a very, very, close family, personal ties with Africa. And actually, Obama does visit Kenya in his presidency, and it's almost like a homecoming in the sense that the Kenyans themselves sort of recognise that Obama is their connection with him. Should also be said, Obama's grandfather actually served in the British Army as a cook, because Kenya obviously originally a British colony. So yeah, Obama did have very sort of close ties with Africa, which sets him apart from other American presidents. Unsurprisingly, I mean, Obama, another thing to say about Obama, obviously he was a liberal, Democrat president, and somebody who clearly believed that the United States had a sort of leadership role to play on the world stage. And under Obama, you do see a significant increase in the amount of American development aid which Africa receives. And unfortunately, I don't have an exact statistic in front of me, but we can check that out for later. On the other hand, I mean, before I get on to the next point, I think maybe it's too strong to say there was a sense of disappointment in Africa with Obama, but I think there was a general, in some quarters at least, there was a sense that perhaps Obama could have done more. So although he, as I say, he does have these sort of connections, and yes, American aid does increase. Still, America's engagement with Africa is pretty limited. So even under Obama, a president which did have these, quite close connections with the continent, even under Obama, so America's engagement in the continent is, it was still relatively limited. Obama was also a fairly reluctant interventionist. He was not, he was somebody who was pretty kind of critical about the idea of military intervention. But the US does intervene in 2011 in Libya. And I mean, going back to what we said earlier about Rwanda and Clinton's decision not to intervene in Rwanda, that I think has quite important consequences for Libya, because there are some key people working in the Obama administration that had been part of the Clinton administration in 1994. There are other people who'd also sort of been quite closely influenced or affected by what happened in Rwanda, including I think Samantha Powell, who'd written a book on that, who was also part of Obama's White House. And I think, I mean, by all accounts, Obama was initially quite skeptical about the idea of intervention in Libya, but he is persuaded by people like Susan Rice and Samantha Power to sort of sanction a sort of military intervention, because they basically say, if you don't, we could have another situation quite similar to Rwanda. If Gaddafi is allowed to send military forces against, rebel towns, places like Benghazi, you could have a bloodbath. You could have mass killings in Libya, quite similar to Rwanda. So I think the experience of Rwanda plays quite an important role when it comes to the Obama administration's decision on Libya. So Obama, I think, is sort of reluctantly persuaded that the United States has to participate in an intervention against Libya in 2011. That said, I mean, the point here says the US restricts its role. It's actually the British and the French who play the leading role in terms of diplomatic efforts when it comes to managing the crisis, and even kind of in terms of contributing military forces. Now, the Americans play a really important role, sort of auxiliary role, but it's mainly British and French and Italian aircraft which were conducting the sort of military operations against Libya. America's participation was still somewhat limited. It's direct sort of combat participation, although the Americans play a really, really critical role in providing support for the sort of European operations. So the Europeans couldn't have done it without America, but it's quite notable, as I say, that America's participation was a lot less visible, a lot less obvious than it had been in previous sort of interventions. US drones active in Somalia. I think not just Somalia, but in other parts of Africa as well. So I mean, Obama certainly continues the war on terror, and one of these fronts remains in Africa. So kind of containing militant Islamic groups. The United States, continue to play a role there, particularly in sort of West Africa. So as I say, the war on terror basically meant that the United States just simply couldn't ignore African affairs altogether. And then we get on to the Trump administration. And the first point, Trump administration relatively indifferent to African affairs. And I think that point comes through in the little text on Trump and Africa, which I uploaded. I mean, Trump basically is not a president who is overly concerned with the world much beyond the United States. Doesn't seem to have a huge amount of interest or a huge amount of knowledge about Africa. Apparently, I think the article mentions this. He described one African country as Nambia, which presumably he was referring to Namibia, which again kind of suggested that he wasn't very knowledgeable about the region. So yeah, I think it's fair to say Trump fairly sort of indifferent to Africa. This is not a region where Trump is particularly concerned about. Trump, as we've already talked about in other classes, I mean, Trump is what's the word? He's pretty isolationist, let's say, or he is not somebody who feels that the United States should be playing a very strong role in certain regions of the world. So by inclination, I would say Trump is not a president who feels that the United States should be playing a leading role in African affairs. As I said at the beginning, he has restricted travel to the United States from several African countries. Certainly, immigration is something that he's sort of clamped down on. He's made some fairly disparaging remarks as well about, I'm not sure if it was explicitly African countries, but certainly countries in the developing world, so, which again sort of suggests that he doesn't take Africa's concerns particularly seriously. On the other hand, again, we mentioned this earlier, there is definitely concern about the expansion of China and Chinese interests in the region. That expansion in recent years has intensified. So China feels that Africa, as a sort of geopolitical space, is an area that they can move into. I think critics of American foreign policy will argue that perhaps the United States last 10, maybe 20 years has given countries like China the space geopolitically to move into Africa. So if you like, the lack of American engagement in the region has given the Chinese, and to some extent the Russians as well, it's given them the opportunity to sort of move into the region, to cultivate ties with the region. So the Chinese are certainly doing an increasing amount of business in Africa, which is causing some concern. I mean, there have certainly been figures in the Trump administration, including John Bolton, who was for a time Trump's national security advisor. He certainly has sort of expressed concern about Chinese activities in Africa. US also has a small military presence in Africa. I think the article I sent you mentioned that at one point there were about 500 American soldiers operating in the Sahel, which is in West Africa, Saharan West Africa. Again, mainly concerned with trying to sort of combat and root out Islamic militant groups. So again, the Americans do sort of have a presence. Hello, sorry, I think my connection failed again. I was just sort of finishing off anyway. The Americans sort of do have a small sort of presence in West Africa. So it's not entirely true that the Trump administration is utterly unengaged in African affairs. But as I say, cut out again. I think I'll finish now anyway before I lose the connection one more time. But yeah, as I say, it's not entirely true that Trump is completely inactive, but the general view is I think Africa in terms of American foreign policy is much less important than the Middle East, Asia, Europe. Paucity or limited amount of American interests that the United States has in the region. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about that. As I said, I've recorded the class, so that will be available on Microsoft Teams on the stream there. So